John, thanks for joining us today. The first question really is, in your view, is the blanket censorship we are experiencing here in the West connected to the persecution of Julian Assange?
Well, I think they're both intimately connected. Julian is emblematic of a wholesale assault on our right to know, on our right to dissent, our right to live in a world that isn't constantly threatened by the prospect of war. So much comes back to Julian. I mean, WikiLeaks in 2010 released two extremely important documents. It released, over the years, it's released a trove of government documents that have informed us so much about the policies, the real policies of our government. But these two were to do with Iraq and Afghanistan. Known rather cynically in Washington, especially Afghanistan before it ended rather abruptly, as forever wars, perpetual wars, which was almost a policy in the United States, that we would live in a time of perpetual war. Julian and WikiLeaks revealed that for what it was, that the United States basically was threatened by the presence, the rise of China, and that its own dominance was at risk. And that's so much in the world is tied to that. The US wishing or striving to reclaim the dominance it had, only actually for the complete dominance was really up to, I suppose, the 1990s. And it wants to go back to that. So all so-called foreign policy, which is a ridiculous term, is tied to the US regaining that dominance. Now, WikiLeaks and Julian revealed what that dominance meant. It meant violence. It meant terrible things happening in country after country. Perhaps we knew that already. Certainly, I've spent most of my career, it seems, reporting on that. But WikiLeaks brought it down to the lies they told in their own words. So what was extraordinary about the release of the war logs and the Iraq war logs was that they were their files, they were their lies, they were their documents. They couldn't be disputed. They were utterly authentic. And so he became, for them, for great power, for the United States and for those in close consort with the United States, he became public enemy number one. Or even worse, he became, as I say, emblematic of a resistance that could build up to the very notion of the United States, and I suppose the West generally, but basically the United States, controlling much of the world's affairs. So he had to be dealt with. But in dealing with Julian Assange, what they are really doing is dealing with us. He is the one suffering. He is the one in Belmarsh prison. He's the one who, as freedom has been taken away and has been put through these Kafkaesque trials I would call them travesties of trials, but really they represent us, because it's taking away piece by piece our right to dissent. If you look at just one very quick example, the way this war in Ukraine is represented. It's represented in the most one-dimensional, jingoistic manner. There's no reason for it, apparently. It all happened out of osmosis, completely unjustified, completely unprovoked. It just happened. And we have to accept that. We mustn't question that. There are many other examples, but that's one that dominates the sort of media consciousness today. So that's why Julian and what happens to Julian is so important to all of us. For me, what happens to Julian is about a terrible case of injustice. But as others have spelt out, it could be the end of any real sense of free press. I don't believe we have much of a free press now, but there are honorable exceptions to that rule, if you like. There are journalists who work hard. There are people who want to speak out. Well, if they succeed in crushing Julian, they may succeed eventually in crushing us. That's not meant to sound paranoid. It isn't. What they've done to Julian Assange should be a warning to all of us who take pride in living in what we hope is a free society.
Can I ask you about the campaign to release him and this change in government in Australia? Is there a positive sign there with the Prime Minister, the new Prime Minister?
Well, the new Prime Minister hasn't done anything to contribute to the campaign to free him. He, some time ago, made a statement, and he told John Shipton, Julian's father, that he felt, I think the words were, enough was enough, that nothing was gained by Julian remaining in prison. They were what I would call weasel words. I didn't find any encouragement in them, others did, and perhaps these are early days in his administration, perhaps he'll surprise the likes of me and actually do something. But I'm not holding my breath.
Yeah, is there any way individuals can internationally put pressure on him?
Well, pressure is what we have. We should never give up pressure. It's about, otherwise we give up. It's of making our voices heard, making them heard in the most effective way possible. There are people here who have done that, especially his family, especially his father, John Shipton, and his brother, Gabriel Shipton, indefatigable in their own campaign to represent their son and to represent the great threat to us all. Also, his wife, Stella Assange. I mean, Stella, tireless in her campaigning. So we have voices that are bringing pressure, if you like, but it's not enough. Australia is a rather compliant society. It doesn't like to see itself in that way, but it is. And people are feeling nice, decent people are feeling rather comfortable. They now have a Labour government. I don't see any reason to feel comfortable because Labour governments have a rather poor record in this country. It was a Labour government that under Prime Minister Julian Gillard that wanted to take away Julian Assange's passport, that really began to collude with the United States in its campaign to put Julian and WikiLeaks out of action. So I can't. I'm afraid I'm not a futurist. I can't guess politicians, even though I've spent a lifetime in politics of another kind. Politicians are rather a mystery to me. They seem to be now and then one or two will appear, will break through, but I think systems are made to prevent that happening. The last great political dissenting government, if you like, the government that really tried to reform, and more than reform, radically reform the system in Australia, was that of Gough Whitlam, which was overthrown in what they call a constitutional coup d'etat in 1975. That's the last one here. So this Labour government seems to be well behaved, saying all the right things. The first thing they did, Albanese, the Prime Minister, did was rush off to Tokyo it seemed to me, perhaps I exaggerate, get the blessing of President Biden.
Yes.
I don't know. We have to wait and see.
Which brings us probably to the final sort of question we'd like to ask you, and that's to do with the conflict in the Ukraine and what putting it in the context of what you say, your film, The Coming War on China, and the role of that conflict in on the borders with Russia.
Well, I think looking at the very big picture, the United States, which is the most important power in the world, because what the US does affects us all, often in a very direct sense, has two enemies. The immediate enemy and the old enemy, I suppose, is Russia, where the communist revolution took place, for which Russia has never been forgiven. And the United States ideology, I suppose, has been long and correctly called anti-communism. And even though there is not a communist government, and there hasn't been a communist government in Russia since 1990, that doesn't matter. They're still Reds. And so Russia is the first enemy, but the new enemy, the big enemy, which was always a kind of sub-enemy, is China. China's rise is the most extraordinary phenomenon in my lifetime. In just over a generation, it went from being a country of widespread impoverishment, economic backwardness, to a country that is the according to some indicators, the biggest, certainly potentially the biggest economic power in the world. That directly threatens the position of the United States. So as I mentioned at the beginning, US policy is basically, to put it in a nutshell, to restore the dominance that it believed it had and did have, and no longer has. We go, to use the cliches, from a bipolar world between superpowers to a multipolar world. There are many competing powers now in the world, but there is a new one capable of competing directly with the United States, and that's China. So I believe that what the United States aims are to deal with the so-called Russian threat and then move on to the main threat, the main game, and that is China. China is a threat almost at every level. As far as the United States is concerned, it actually isn't a threat. Anybody who's looked closely at China or been to China or thought intelligently about China knows that China has it will claim its so-called sphere of influence in economic terms because it's the most populous country in the world, and it's where all our goods are manufactured. So it is a very powerful country, but it has no interest in militarism. As somebody in not somebody, his name is Eric Lee, a very astute commentator in Shanghai, said, we built the Great Wall in China to keep the barbarians out, not to attack them. Mm-hmm. I think that perhaps sums it up. That's China's view of itself. Prosperity, economic development is everything in China. Any suggestion that it spend huge amounts, and it's already having to spend huge amounts, but spend the kind of resources that the Soviet Union did on armaments and thus destroy its economic base, that's anathema in China. Mm-hmm. But the perception is completely different in the United States. China is an enemy, potential enemy, and in fact, for many in the US, they're already at war with China. So in some ways, the war in Ukraine, which the United States is fighting by proxy because it's supplying Ukraine with the wherewithal to, it hopes, see off the Russians. It's a rehearsal, perhaps, for what might follow later on. There's been comparisons made, which I think are fatuous, actually, but they're still made, between Ukraine as a proxy for the war with Russia and Taiwan as a proxy for the war with China.